science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk, a podcast dedicated to conversations on the status of contemporary architecture and to advancing that conversation through interdisciplinary means. Over the last few weeks, we have been interrogating this national modernist project in South Asia and in particular in India, and trying to evaluate its legacy and implications for thinking the present. Today we continue that conversation with Dan Williamson, who has recently completed a PhD on the life and times of mid-century postcolonial Ahmedabad, which, if you are not familiar with, is a city in Western India which has been home to some of the best and most amazing advances in Indian modernism, hosting not only the likes of Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, but also many a generation of Indian modernists, such as, of course, B.V. Doshi, Charles Correa, Hasmukh Patel, and so many others. Ahmedabad is also the city that hosted and from where Doshi founded the School of Architecture that is now known as CEP University, surely one of the premier thinking institutions of India. And it is of late also the city where the neo-nationalist Indian project, the post-Nehruvian modernist project, has been spearheaded in the form of the government of Narendra Modi and his architectural ambitions. So we have a discussion about all of that with Dan Williamson in terms of his dissertation and what Ahmedabad was in the 50s and 60s and why and how it came to be this very special place. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope to do a lot more on this topic in the future. Here we go.
Dan, thank you for having this conversation with me. So glad to have you here on Architecture Talk. Many of these conversations that I'm having nowadays are kind of come out of this panel discussion that I had recently with Widler, Partha, Mark Jarzambek, and Sunil Khilnani, and some of these are reactions and responses to that. So I'm so glad to be able to catch up with you. First, let's get a little introduction about you. So Dan, this is all very South Asian. You're not South Asian. What the hell were you doing in Ahmedabad? How did you get into this?
I went to India right after I graduated from undergraduate college, and I was a philosophy major who had started drifting towards architecture as something I had kind of just moved towards architecture. I thought it was a little more grounded in reality, but it was still about kind of expressing ideas and trying to implement them in the world. And I went to India with a friend of mine who I eventually married. And when I was traveling around, of course, we were looking at old things, but I was also struck immediately by the modernity of so many of the buildings, or at least the reflection that, and this was something, I was fairly naive at the time, but it was not something that I really knew about. And I thought, well, this is not how you picture India, or this is not how the ideas about India are received.
What were you looking for? What was the other India that you and your partner went there looking for? You went on a yoga retreat, meditation retreat?
No.
To find yourself?
I was a kind of a budding art and architectural historian. So I was looking for, the monuments of the Mughals, Ajanta caves, Sanchi, we did a whole big thing, but it was
okay.
It was,
but then modern architecture, you ran into modern architecture.
I ran into modern architecture, and so I just, I put that away in the back of my mind. And then when I was pursuing what eventually kind of became a master's degree in architectural history, this became something I decided I wanted to kind of look at more seriously. Kind of in the master's degree, we're kind of just looking at more of the kind of colonial era 19th century Mumbai. I wrote about the Crawford markets.
I see.
And then as I kind of wanted to pursue a PhD, I really thought about, obviously Ahmedabad had, as you kind of put it in your introduction, it had this kind of reputation as this crucible, as somebody who had been looking at it from the outside. It presented, I thought, an intriguing place to look at, at kind of modern architectural development. I was naive enough to think I could write about such a huge topic, which was maybe
every topic is a huge topic the
Yeah.
moment you get into it.
Once you get into it, you
From a distance, you would think mid-century Ahmedabad would be a very specialized topic, but actually, of course, it's
as soon as you step into it, you feel the floor kind of drop out, and it's a little frightening.
I like the way you describe it. Yeah.
But so that's kind of how I ended up in Ahmedabad, and I was there, I think, doing most of the research in kind of 2009, 2010.
So what was the research like? I mean, research means what? There are good archives. How did you get information?
So, obviously, if we're dealing with the kind of post-colonial scene, we have to deal with Kahn and Corbusier. So those archives obviously
are well established.
Were well established and easy enough to look at. And I do think, even this is part of the reason that this is such a difficult topic, is that to really understand it, you have to go to you have to go to these different places as well.
Yeah.
But in Ahmedabad, it was working out of SEP's library, and SEP, of course, is the architecture school. And it was a lot of going on site and meeting with as many architects as possible, and kind of probing them for their stories. Meeting a lot of the clients, trying to ingratiate myself and meet with as many of these textile mill owner families that we can talk more about, and then to dig in and look for archives. I went to Delhi to Convinda's office and
For Atira.
For Atira, and unfortunately they didn't have as much, but they did have drawings for the Hari Vallabhdas house. Which is, to my mind, a really significant project. So it was that kind of thing. It really is kind of building these things.
So like an amorphous kind of networking.
Yeah.
But did you find some great stored archive, somebody's personal collection or anything that you relied on heavily?
The municipality had some things that were okay. I went to the Sarabhai Foundation, and they had some interesting items about the history of their house that helped put Corbusier's Sarabhai house in a kind of broader context within that whole kind of compound. I was kind of researching at a time that I think Charles Correa was kind of putting together his archive, which I've since seen, which is, has certainly some use. One issue is that there is not as much documentation as one would hope.
So what did you learn? I lived in Ahmedabad for a few years, but I'm not from Gujarat. I'm not Ahmedabadi. And I might as well be from the United States, because being a Punjabi is kind of like from another planet compared to the Gujaratis.
Right.
So I felt very much, in some ways, like an outsider, because this feels to me like Ahmedabad has a very distinct / cosmopolitan but insular, really outward looking and worldly, but strangely parochial culture.
Well, I think you've put it exactly right. I think obviously, in order to entice all of these architects to Ahmedabad, you had a very insular group of architectural patrons, these textile mill owners, who were on the one hand very worldly, right? I mean, they had offices in New York City and so on and so forth. But it is still very much a kind of insular place, and I would see in some of the kind of testimonies about people, like architects who came and worked for Khan in the 60s, who were just I need to get out of Ahmedabad. This place is kind of stultifying. So it is a very strange kind of phenomenon.
What produced this situation as you see it that produced this amazing architectural milieu? What was
Right.
it?
Well, I mean, so I do think it starts with the textile mill owning families. And I think this kind of contradiction that you see, or I guess not a contradiction, but this kind of dichotomy that you see between something that feels kind of very insular and very kind of rooted in a very particular kind of locale, but with this kind of worldliness as well. I mean, this is coming from these families. And so in particular, it's really two families who are kind of interlinked and interconnected with each other. It's Kasturba Lalbai,
Right, Lalbai,
and it's the Sarabhai family. And so I did get to talk to Gira Sarabhai, who is really a very key and instrumental figure in this whole story. One thing that I discovered is that the kind of architectural patronage had already been going on for a couple of decades, and it had been very India focused. You know, they had brought in Claude Batley to design a lot of buildings.
I see.
And they had brought in, so Gira Sarabhai had studied at Rabindranath Tagore's art school, and they had brought Surendranath Kaur to do a redo of the house and the retreat. And so this has all been kind of blooming and blossoming in the 30s. I mean, there's some lovely Claude Batley buildings kind of sprinkled throughout Ahmedabad. But I do think with independence, you see this desire to move from a kind of colonial milieu to a kind of to a broader cosmopolitan viewpoint.
Yeah, for sure. But what I'm learning from you is that they had already sort of adopted some ideas of modernism and modern architecture as critical elements, and they were and after independence, they in a sense just continued it, but made it more a particular flavor that was in sync, I suppose, with the Nehruvian choices as well, given Chandigarh and so on. Yeah,
I think so. But it starts right. I mean, it really does start even before Nehru has started to reach out. I mean, there's a famous Frank Lloyd Wright project for
which was not built.
It's built. I mean, and that starts out. I mean, even the first letters for that go out to Frank Lloyd Wright in 1946. And Gira Sarabhai told me essentially, what was interesting is she had gone to Japan and had asked Antonin Raymond to recommend an architect. And she was actually, she had design interest. And I think this is one of the interesting things. And this is one of the really unique things about these clients is that, they were looking to become designers themselves in a sense. It was a kind of participatory.
Why was this particular family? These particular families. I mean, more the Sarabhais. Did the Lalbhais also want to be designers?
Well, no, I think Kasturba Lalbai saw it as kind of his civic duty to be promoting a kind of civic architecture, right? Because he saw himself. One thing about Ahmedabad is it has this kind of very interesting political history where they were led by a kind of particular business leader. And so he saw that, I think he saw that as kind of an extension of his legacy. Their father, Ambalal, was really kind of also, if you go back to the teens and 20s, right? I mean, he's trying to cultivate this very cosmopolitan kind of modern identity. He's described as kind of being the first person to be driving around in like a kind of very fancy high-end car. But at the same time, he's responsible for keeping Gandhi's ashram going when there was a giant controversy about Gandhi letting kind of untouchables into the ashram. So, I think there's this kind of mold breaking kind of attitude towards the family that starts with the father.
With Ambalal. And where did he get that attitude from? Just in the air, in nationalism and so on, or you have a more specific thing?
I don't want to say it's a kind of personality thing, perhaps, but I think his parents had died when he was young. I don't want to kind of misspeak here, but I think his parents had died when he was young, and it just seemed like he was a person who was going to break rules. He broke rules about his marriage in terms of who he married and so on.
He married out of caste.
Still married a Jane,
Yeah.
but not from the proper families. There was some, and so then I think he really tried to cultivate this attitude in his children. I mean, and there is something, I think you were talking about kind of parallels with Nehru. I mean, in terms of Nehru's kind of cosmopolitanism and
Yeah.
They went abroad quite often when they were young. They lived a very insular life. Ambalal basically hired a bunch of European tutors to come teach. He basically formed a little school in the retreat itself, and they were all educated there. And they, with some of the Kasturbai Lalbai's children who lived next door. And so I think he did cultivate this kind of attitude and outlook. And I think Gira Sarabhai, so, again, she decided she was going to go into design, and she had gone to Tagore's school, and then she was looking to kind of globally expand. So when they went to Raymond, which I'm assuming, and I think she pretty much confirmed this, that they had seen Golconda essentially.
Yeah. And via Rabindranath Tagore, that would be an important Japan connection, right?
Right.
Tagore was in strong connection with Japan. Yeah.
So
they went to see Raymond in Japan.
Yeah, and she said
just after the war. Yeah,
this was just after the war. They wanted somebody who they could hire to do some buildings that they would also kind of continue to have this mentor relationship with. And so they brought. So he suggested Wright, and of course he had trained with
Wright. Yeah.
And I think he thought, well, they can go and study at Taliesin, which she did do for a few months. It doesn't seem like. There's sometimes you read things where she did a full kind of Taliesin fellowship. She didn't end up finishing it. But I think this is kind of how the ball gets rolling, is really with this with the Frank Lloyd Wright project, in terms of kind of shifting from looking within India to kind of looking more broadly. And it does, it is paralleling. It is right at this moment of independence, where suddenly I think the world is opened up, right, in an interesting way.
So that's interesting. So there's sort of a tunneling from a national modernists. We are more the Rabindranath Tagore route,
right,
up to Japan, over the Pacific into the United States and the milieu and the sort of the context of Wrightian modernism.
Right.
So then, how does it cross the Atlantic and get to Corb? Well, that's because he came to Chandigarh, or
the Frank Lloyd Wright building doesn't quite happen.
Why didn't it happen? Why?
It ran afoul of the building codes. He sent this gigantic packet of calculations, and there were still kind of some very strict building codes that were kind of hangovers from what the British had imposed. And I think the contractor didn't understand what he was trying to do. It's a really great project, and it is actually. I think it's a key project for his own kind of development, in terms of what he does there kind of helps lead to the Morris shop, which helps lead to the Guggenheim.
I see. That's an interesting thing. So you think it was preliminary to Guggenheim? It felt more like one of his California projects.
Well, so it's this interesting hybrid, right? Because it has a textile block kind of shell that wraps around it, and I think there's some really interesting kind of ideology emerging about why the textile block for India. That's wrapping around essentially a series of kind of platforms. Oh, and it's topped by some like some cantilevered falling water things. But the interior was designed to have this kind of, and it wasn't kind of completely a spiraling ramp, but it is like all a single room. Like the idea was that the walls were, the floors were independent of the walls, and there was a sense that you were inside this thing. And then, what Gautam and Gira Sarabhai were really focused on in their letters to and from each other, because they both basically were writing letters while she was at Taliesin, was this idea of display, and this kind of, they really wanted to kind of modernize and transform how goods were sold. And there's almost this kind of museification of the objects that was supposed to take place within this kind of open space that had a kind of spiraling ramp through it. That's what eventually happens with the Morris shop. But this is kind of forerunner to the Morris shop. And also in terms of, I think, this kind of fetishization of the consumer good.
So it's the Apple Store.
Yeah, basically, you're going to have one object there, and then this is what they spent all their time talking about, was this idea of having, like, we're going to have the one object, and then you go up and you tell the clerk you want this object, and we're going to have a bunch of pneumatic tubes that run through the building, and that's going to send down to the basement, and we'll kind of bring out the object.
Griffin was also practicing in India at this time, right? I mean, he has a deep Wright connection, yeah.
Yeah, so he had deep Wright connections, and that might have also been part of it, right? Because there is a kind of municipal theater project that he did. It's more in the 30s, though. So he came through Ahmedabad in the 30s, and there's this drawing that you can see.
So there's this whole Wright thing, and Gira Sarabhai is in Taliesin, and Gautam and Gira are putting this project together, running into municipal difficulties, as always, as everything does.
Mm-hmm.
So then what happens?
As terms of what happens to that project, of course, they end up kind of doing their kind of Calico Dome because they had excavated the site on Relief Road.
Yeah.
So they did their Calico Dome, and then they did the original textile museum was on their the grounds of their mill, and they did this Wrightian thing for that. And then this is about the time that you also have Convinda coming over. The way I kind of connect these things is it does seem like the mill owners were really trying to radically modernize the textile industry and to create kind of modernized consumer markets, right? So the shop is really about kind of modernizing things on the consumption end.
Right.
Atira is is this textile industry research association. They're going to do all these experiments. They're going to allow them to kind of apply those experiments on the production end. It's part of this idea of, well, we're independent and now we can kind of forge our own kind of vision of modernity. Although it still is in this kind of development model where they are kind of incorporating this. It's about creating consumption-based markets and industrializing. So Convinda came in, but that was through Vikram Sarabhai, Gira's brother.
Right.
And he came in to do Atira. This was Vikram's big idea about kind of modernizing the industry, and Convinda had gone to study at Harvard with Gropius, and his thesis was about designing modernized industrial buildings. That was what he'd gone to study. He went there on a scholarship where it was specifically, the money was there to go do that. So Convinda's there kind of about the same time that the Frank Lloyd Wright project falls apart. One thing I think that's interesting here is that, especially compared to Chandigarh, right, there is a much more almost a kind of eclectic idea. Is there any underlying thought process to this, right? Like, is it that it's Gropius for the factory buildings and Wright for the, I'm not sure it was that much.
No, not that master planned.
Right.
But there was definitely, it seems like, it results in the Mill Owners Association building, and already we have Atira. So there's a sort of a shared culture, is there not, amongst the mill owners?
Oh, absolutely.
Where does that come from, and how did that develop, and why did that develop? Why weren't they just competitive with each other and gouging each other's profits and, trying to be completely different from each other? It's so amazing that a textile series of families would not only patronize modernism, but do it in a almost collective way.
That has deep roots in the history of Ahmedabad. The way that businesses were run is that they all had guilds, right? And they all had kind of heads of guilds. And so when the textile industry kind of establishes itself, it builds itself out of that older guild mentality. And so they're very much capitalist, right? But I think there's a sense that they recognize that kind of collectively they can maximize their profits, kind of working together. So Atira is basically funded by the Mill Owners Association. Prior to the building, obviously they'd been around. The association already existed, and they had offices kind of in the old city.
Right.
That is one of the kind of interesting and unique aspects of this story, right? We have stories about kind of the integration and the use of modern architecture to kind of promote industrialist ideas and industrial ends. But this is certainly a unique way of handling the linkage between the two.
I was whose book was I recently? Oh, I was reading The Idea of India again with Sunil Khilnani's. And this time I paid attention. He's describing this situation after 1947. And a couple of points that he makes is, one is that nothing was settled. What post-colonial India was going to be. It was not like there were blueprints ready to go, and it was deeply contested, and it could have gone many ways.
Yeah.
Of course, there were certain accidents like the deaths of Gandhi and Patel, etc., which were instrumental in putting Nehru in the driver's seat. But even in the Nehruvian world, a blueprint wasn't there. And Nehru wanted, and I suppose Nehru is a bit of a metonym. I mean, I suppose it'd be the Indian nationalist cosmopolitan culture, if you like, was very keen to establish modern India on its own foundation. Normally modernization is written up, Indian modernization is written up as a catch-up with the West strategy. And to a certain extent, of course, that was true to sort of make up for the industrial backwardness, if you like. But it wasn't just that. Clearly, it was very much, we want to do this differently and we don't want to do it right. That was very much in the air. So do you find that kind of a discourse in letters or literature or interviews?
Well, absolutely, yeah. When you look at the mission of Attira itself, which Nehru came and inaugurated Attira, which is important, right? Because Attira this is where the mill owners are kind of plugging into the kind of the Nehruvian ideal, is that Attira really is in many ways kind of the embodiment of this idea of we're going to industrialize, but we're going to industrialize on our own terms. We're going to take the best that we can, we will bring in experts from Europe or Britain or where have you, but the goal is to have those experts train us, and then, then we're going to kind of do it our own way, or bring them in also from the Soviet Union, right? Because that's also very much a part of it. So you see that as well. And yeah, I mean, even this idea of like a kind of Nehruvian socialism was definitely kind of up in the air, right, in terms of the actual construction of the economy. So like there's this, there's this very famous kind of Bombay plan that was floated by
by the industrialists.
Industrialists. So the Kasturbai Lalbai was part of that. Was this and this was the idea here.
And the Sarabhais were not part of that?
The Sarabhais were not part of that, no. They didn't participate. But
the Bombay plan's famous, yes.
Right. Yeah. And so that's an interesting kind of idea of like, well, how far will the capitalists go in terms of ceding to socialist demands? And I think what the mill owners kind of realized is, well, actually we can use the socialist economy to our advantage, because we can basically use the government in some ways to kind of subsidize a lot of what we're doing.
Right. I mean, I'm trying to put down with you the roots of Ahmedabad modernism, and I suppose ultimately the School of Architecture and NID and so on, as a not catch up with the West strategy, but as a sort of a enrooting of a different modernist experiment and ethos.
Yeah, I do think that, and I guess it gets into this whole tricky question of modernism and how universal it is to begin with, right? I would say the idea of bringing a variety of experts into a situation and pulling different ideas from different people as a means to kind of forge your own way seems to certainly be part of these early experiments in kind of the architectural patronage of the Sarabhais and the Lalbais, and does find, I think, parallel in the experiments that are going on in the institutions that they're designing, right, in terms of what Attira's goal was. And is follows through in terms of the Indian Institute of Management and its very complicated relationship with the Ford Foundation, with the Harvard Business School, but also in terms of the kinds of professors they're bringing in.
Kind of the flip side of all this is Kanwinder comes into towns and then leaves town. Charles Correa comes into town and then leaves town because he's like, not my town. And I remember Doshi once telling me the story that he came to Chandigarh first after his Corbusier years. And he felt he had to get out of town. The Punjabis didn't want him. Some hierarchy issues.
They get out of town, but they come back and design more buildings. I mean, there's they design some houses.
Yeah, they do. So anyway, there's that in and out. We don't need to get too far down that road. But slowly out of all of this emerges Doshi.
You have, of course, the impetus of bringing in Le Corbusier. And this is interesting. It's always people think about first, they think about the houses and they think about the Millowners Association building, but he was actually brought in to design the museum. That was why they brought him.
Since yeah.
Yeah. So they approached him through the municipality, but really behind the scenes, it was Gir and Gautam Sarabhai, because they're the ones who directly worked with him in terms of building the program of the whole cultural center up. And so, of course, that's really how Doshi comes into the scene as well. He had been working in Le Corbusier's office for a number of years. He was one of the main people in Le Corbusier's atelier who worked on the Millowners Association building. There's a number of drawings in his hand.
Yeah, but you're saying that comes later, right? I mean, first Corb is brought in for the museum, and really the Sarabhai, Gautam and Gira are his clients. And Corbusier brings in Doshi as his a man on site, yes?
Right. But so all the projects happen simultaneously. So Le Corbusier comes, and then by the time he leaves, there's actually 4 or 5 projects. There's the unbuilt mayor's house.
Yeah.
At one point, he was going to design a mill building. Like there's a little drawing for that. So they brought him in, and then they piled the projects on, and then it receded. So he was working on all 4 of them simultaneously. But the initial invitation was about the municipal museum.
And the invitation was from whom?
It was from the municipality. It was
but managed by Gautam and Gira. It wasn't.
Yeah, because when he came, so when he came, he stayed at the retreat. Again, they have this kind of massive house. There's all these guest wings. They have so many people just coming through there, right? So when Rabindranath Tagore comes, he stays at their house. And they're also, in terms of their kind of cosmopolitan attitude, they're inviting like Alexander Calder, they're inviting, John Cage and Merce Cunningham and so on and so forth. And when most of these people, when they come, it's really through the Sarabhais, and they usually stay in these kind of guest suites in the retreat that are now, part of the museum there. Well, what was going on at the dinners and so on and so forth, right? That's where you really have, I think, a kind of gap, right? Because that's where all the rich conversation was happening about what does it mean to be modern, and you get hints of this in some of the letters and some of people's recollections. Mrinalini Sarabhai, who was married to Vikram, who's this kind of great dancer, talks about having debates between her and Gira about what modernity means and whether it's going to be rooted in the past or whether it's something that's complete break and whether it's universal. So they were having these debates that you can kind of read around the edges of.
I see. So did you spend time in the retreat?
I did, yeah. So I spent, I went through a few times through the museum, and then they have a kind of foundation archive there that I went through, and again, it didn't have as much as I hoped for, but it did actually have this kind of really great documentation of the history of their house, of the house itself, that allows you to kind of put it in context.
So the Sarabhais don't have a personal archive of all you have. Well,
they did call it. It's their foundation archive.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's not as extensive as one would hope, or at least what I saw. It's also about what people will show you.
Right. What people show you is a big issue. Okay, so that's how Corb got into all of this, invited by the Sarabhais, and then Doshi's practice gets going.
Right.
On the backs of that. And then how does IAM happen?
So IAM happens, so Doshi, decides that he's going to establish his practice in Ahmedabad after he kind of completes the oversight of, And so, what happened was, he went to Chandigarh, and then what he ended up doing is kind of replacing Wright, who was Le Corbusier's on-site architect, and he kind of came to Ahmedabad to finish the oversight of all the projects. And then so he establishes his own practice.
Who was the? He replaced who?
Jean-Louis Wright, I think. So he was a member of Le Corbusier's architecture firm, and they sent him. He had a lot of issues cross-culturally with the clients. So they brought Doshi in to smooth things over. I asked a lot of the different architects how they ended up kind of with their first commissions, and what they would say is like, Kasturbai Lalbai would give them like a little tiny project, like these little buildings that either don't survive or that they don't even really talk about very much.
Yeah.
And he would see if they could do that. And if they did that to his liking, then, you would kind of open things up. So there are some interesting early buildings by Doshi that aren't even, are still not kind of well known. And actually, they probably just got demolished in the past couple of years. But he did these like little buildings around the Gujarat University, because all of that land was run by the Ahmedabad Education Society, which was basically Kasturbai Lalbai's institution to promote education.
That's right. That's right. Still very active, still very powerful.
Yeah. So like Doshi designed like a little badminton court. I don't know if you ever saw it. It was behind SEPT, and it's actually where SEPT started before they built their campus, as they worked out of the badminton court. It's just really, I think it got
badminton
destroyed.
Court, really?
Yeah, it's really beautiful. He basically took these, created this kind of butterfly roof, and it's that kind of double shell roof.
Yeah.
And inside, actually, so you have these kind of balconies that were set up. And I talked to Arun Vakil, and he was like, well, what we would do is we would sit up above. The students would be all working on kind of the badminton court, and we'd be on this kind of balcony. And he kind of implied that that's kind of where they got this idea of the kind of interlocking studio spaces for SEP, that was
I see, from that situation.
Yeah. But anyway.
Ratsubhai Vakil. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Doshi, gets these little projects, and then he gets basically Le Corbusier wrote to Siegfried Gideon and was like, I have this great Indian architect. I want you to give him a Graham fellowship to go to the US. Yeah. And he wrote Doshi, and he said, you need to go to the US so you can kind of get immersed in alternative culture and see what you're rejecting, more or less, right? Because of course, Le Corbusier's kind of whole vision for India was it was going to be this anti-consumerist, kind of vision of modernity.
Again, it's the second machine age, Corbusier's vision. Now I'm realizing more and more, it was more a response to the ethos of the time around people. It's the other way around. Nehru and all these people were trying to forge an alternate India.
Yeah.
And Corbusier was sort of glomming in on that. It wasn't the other way around. It's like Cobb showing up and saying India should be this.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Although, I do think there's a tension, obviously, between this kind of almost deindustrial version that Le Corbusier has in his mind, and the fact that he's working with Nehru and with these textile industrialists. There's
it's not deindustrial, it's post-capitalist.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah,
it's industrial, but second machine age, as he calls it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I guess you're right. Yeah, but the industry is going to be kind of more integrated holistically into the society, I guess.
That's right.
Vision for it.
Holistically integrated, and basically captains of industry and state run.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And this is very much Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier's relationship with the clients is very interesting because he does, and of course he does this over and over again. He kind of he's like, I found my person who's going to be the authority. And then they disappoint him because they're
always. So
that happens, of course, with the mill owners as well. But
of course. In the end, Corbusier was disappointed with everyone, but that, he could never, his mom didn't like him. So he was never going to be, anyway, let's not get into that.
Yeah. So he sent, there's a letter, it's a recollection of Doshi where he said, okay, you need to go and kind of immerse yourself in America again, as a kind of cautionary tale almost. So he goes there with his Graham Foundation, and he goes down to University of Pennsylvania, and he gives a lecture on the Atira housing that he had just done. And Louis Kahn really responds very positively to them, and they forge a friendship. And then Doshi goes off and he goes through Japan and meets Kenzo Tange and Tange's engineers and so on. And so that also has a big impact on him. So the Indian Institute of Management basically was going to be a government program. Vikram Sarabhai and Kasturbai Lalbhai had for many years been trying to promote this idea that we need to build a cadre of managers and kind of transform into a managerial capitalism.
Right.
So they went to Doshi and they were like, can you design this campus? And he said, it's too much for me, but I met this great architect who I think is the equivalent of Le Corbusier. And so that's kind of how this was kind of negotiated. And then of course it's also very complicated because of all of there's also obviously the role of the Ford Foundation. The National Institute of Design is the architect of record. So that's also very much a part of this story. And so, part of the idea here, and National Institute of Design is being run by Gautam Sarabhai, and officially, and Giro Sarabhai is playing a very important role there.
Right.
So once again, it is this idea of like, we're going to have the buildings, but we're also going to have this kind of experience of gaining knowledge from the architect happening. That really goes, I think, all the way back to when they were designing their house in the 30s with a Surendranat car. So that's how that kind of ends up unfolding, more or less.
Hasmukh Patel enters like late 60s, right?
Late 60s. Yeah. So that was he was tricky to fit in because I did need to, I spent a lot of time, I mean, he was very generous with his time. So I spent a lot of time talking to him.
He was a great guy.
Yeah. I went to his house.
Beautiful house. Gorgeous house.
Really beautiful house.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting thing, right? Because he does a project. He told me, so again, he's one of the people who told me, okay, so you have to go, if you want to kind of get design in Ahmedabad, you go and you design a project for Kasturbai Lalbhai, and if he likes it, you get a carte blanche. So he designed some little project for them. His big clients, at least early on, are really more kind of the St. Xavier's, right? Kind of these
the Jesuits.
Educational, right? The Jesuits, essentially, right? So got the little school, and then he's
like his own little Eddie, right? I mean, he's sort of in this whole milieu.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what's interesting as well, is that I think, and especially as you kind of look at his projects as you kind of move into the 70s and 80s, one of the reasons I tried to cap things at 68, I mean, I think part of it is we're talking about, well, when was the end of this mid-century modern era in Ahmedabad? Part of it is, I tried to find what are things that suggests things have changed. There were big language riots in '69 that seemed to have sucked a lot of really positive
energy,
in terms of like, we can do anything. But also that's, it's around the 60s and into the 70s that you start to see the break of the kind of mill owners' stranglehold on the city. Start to see this kind of opening up and diversification of the kinds of clients. I mean, the architectural language continues in really interesting ways. I wanted to write about him, but it was hard for me to get into his scene. I mean, I was really interested in the modernist houses that crop up all over the city, and this idea as well of like being able to reimagine.
You mean like Charles Correa and so on?
Obviously, you have
You're talking 60s still, right?
In the 60s. You have Charles Correa's got a number of houses. Most of them have been demolished, unfortunately. Bernard Cohn, who came to help set up Sept University, does a number of interesting houses. Again, this Hari Vallabhdas house by Convenda, I think, is just really fantastic.
I don't know anything about it. I look forward to looking at it.
So I was really interested in ideas about, well, what is it, this was also a time, because everything was kind of open in the air. This question of what does the Indian family look like in a kind of post-independence modernist world, and there were people who were arguing that as you modernize, you're going to kind of break into nuclear family units, and it means the end of the extended family networks. But the way that these kind of modernist houses kind of negotiate kind of extended family relationships, I found quite fascinating as well.
So what happened? I mean, as we are. So what happened? How did it all come apart? Late 60s or 70s or whatever it was. How do you conclude your narrative?
It didn't really end with a bang, right? I mean, it ended with a whimper, right? And to me, part of it is, okay, well, the clients. There was, in addition to these kind of riots that kind of marked, I think, the end of a kind of real optimism about Ahmedabad, there was a big financial crash for the mill owners. And then there was this kind of long slide till the early to mid 80s when basically the bottom fell out of the mill owners' industries, which led to kind of massive layoffs and a closure of all of the mills. And so that's really the official end. So, that completely changes, I think, obviously the civic and political dynamics of the city. But even throughout the 60s, you start to see the weakening of their dominance, from multiple kind of political sides. You got communist mayor in the city in the kind of mid 60s, and that's pretty much what I think kills the chance for the Sanskar Kala Kendra to become anything like what they had envisioned for it. And then I think this, on the one hand you have the slide, but on the other hand you could see it as well. The positive view would be, well, it's like opening up now of the kinds of clients that you have in the city, right? In terms of a much more diverse set of clients, although also perhaps being less civically oriented and more interested in architecture primarily as part of a capitalist real estate development issue.
Sure. No, the culture completely shifts nationally in the 70s,
Right.
70s is a kind of a watershed moment in global history, but certainly in South Asian history.
Yeah.
With Indira Gandhi trying to reinvent the Nehruvian moment, but basically unsuccessfully.
Yeah.
So what is your, as we move to the end here, what did you learn? What's your takeaway from all of this narrative, this experience, not this experience, or the learning of this narrative?
To understand Ahmedabad, I think you really do have to understand the specific social realities that were going on there. And so the interesting question here is something that I think dovetails a lot of what you've been thinking about and talking about lately is what is the nature of modernity, especially as it kind of manifests itself in South Asia, and where is the line between modernity as a global phenomenon and these specific kind of localized manifestations that really do take a globalizing phenomenon, because of course the buildings themselves are using the same materials that you're seeing in kind of the entire brutalist canon. But to me, what I found is, what makes this a kind of localized phenomenon is the way that there is this reaction to both the already existing kind of social order and how to translate that into a modern realm, as well as a response to already existing very rich cultural history in Ahmedabad in terms of the architecture, and a response to all of these kind of localizing conditions.
Yeah, beautiful narrative of what I'm trying to well, not me, a lot of people are trying to advocate as the mechanics of global modernism, where it's not about the proliferation of a certain style, the Euro originated, but it's a translocal phenomena with variegated roots and imperatives that both taps into and significantly influences what might be considered to be an international aesthetic vocabulary. So thank you very much for this work, Dan. I hope you get to teach it, and I hope to continue to read with your further research on this, and maybe we're going to find some way to collaborate somewhere.
Yes, I hope so.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.